Good afternoon. Welcome to the Tropical Update on August 12th, 2021, regarding Tropical Depression Fred and Invest 95L. We're going to talk about 95L last here, as Fred is the less threatening system, even though it is closer to land. So, here's Fred, by the way. You can barely see it here in the north central Caribbean here. If we get a closer look here in the Western Atlantic satellite loop, you can see Fred here rotating away very slowly off to the west-northwest here north of Cuba. It had barely missed Cuba, but had to pay the price by going over the highest mountains in the Caribbean here and essentially lost its mid-level circulation along the way, which left the system void of convection. It is actually surprising that its circulation even survived the trek over the mountains here. So this is not a very impressive system. This is a pretty abysmal looking system here. Doesn't really have a lot of convection over it right now. There's maybe a little bit of storms here on the southern side, but that may also be attributed to land convergence. You have some convection here, but nothing over the exact center of the system, which is right here. And this may take a while to recover. It's been off the islands now for 12 hours, so it has recovered a little bit. You can see that there's some convection trying to develop here, but if we give it about 48 hours, it may be able to recover a little bit more convection and may be able to organize some as it approaches the Florida Straits. It does have probably about 36 hours before it reaches less favorable conditions here, and it does have a mountain to climb, essentially, in terms of the level of organization that it needs to achieve in order for it to be able to survive its next big hurdle that it has. If we look at the water vapor loop, you can see what that hurdle is. You can also barely see Fred here. This is where Fred is. And you can see there is an upper level low centered near or over Florida. It's kind of hard to tell, but this is going to be producing a lot of southwesterly flow over the region that Fred is about to waltz right into. And currently the system is under a pretty nice anticyclone here, largely due to these two upper level lows that you can see. There's one to the northeast of Fred and one to the northwest of Fred, and this is kind of generally producing anticyclonic flow over the system, which helps ventilate the convection a little bit, and that's why you're seeing a generally convectively active region here under this anticyclone. Unfortunately, none of that over Fred for this poor system here, but it may be able to increase some of that convective activity over its center here as it continues to meander closer and closer to the Florida Straits. And this is not going in any hurry, really, to organize here. This is not a very well-defined system here, and it's honestly surprising that it is even this well-defined. And it will continue to move rather slowly off to the west-northwest here. It may wobble onshore, actually, if the circulation gets pulled into some of the Cuban terrain here. But we'll have to watch for that. Obviously, these forecast angles are very finicky and very difficult to deal with because their margin for error is so small. But it should be able to split the gap between Florida and Cuba here. So if we look at the 5-day cone here, you can see that the National Hurricane Center actually keeps it a depression through tomorrow morning and doesn't strengthen it into a tropical storm until Friday evening, actually. Tropical storm watches are up for northern Cuba and the Turks and Caicos Islands, but this is going to be a very gradual process of reorganizing here. This is not expected to become a hurricane and probably won't become a formidable tropical cyclone period here as it meanders off to the west-northwest. It will turn off to the north and west and eventually off to the north. This is something that is up for grabs here in terms of what level of turn it will be going through. Obviously, if it's a stronger system, it'll turn sooner because it'll feel the upper level steering flow more, which is, if we go back to the water vapor loop over the northwest Atlantic, you can see a generally strong-ish mid-level ridge here over just to the north of the Bahamas, but it does end. The edge of that mid-level ridge is right next to the upper level low as it backs away, and this will be kind of pushing in a little bit. It's not a very strong upper level ridge or mid-level ridge here, so the upper level flow generally will be out of the south. This is also a shearing aspect of the environment that it will be heading into, because the mid-level flow is generally out of the south, upper level flow is perpendicular to that, and the lower level flow is generally out of the east. So this is not a very favorable environment for intensification, which may actually lead to the system being pushed a little bit more to the west, because if you watch the low-level clouds here, you can see that the flow is generally to the west here. And so a weaker storm, a storm that stays weaker longer at least, would likely move a little bit to the west here. Again, we're talking about a weaker system, so this doesn't really have impact, insane impact implications for the northern Gulf Coast, but it would be in your best interest if you are on the northern Gulf Coast, say from like Louisiana and to Alabama here, and obviously the Florida Panhandle and anywhere east. You should be watching this just in case it does actually come this far west. It doesn't really look amazing here. NHC track forecast, though, is very, very good typically, so we're probably going to see a track somewhere along the lines within this cone, but just for safety's sake, please do be watching this. If you are on the northern Gulf Coast, you may be dealing with a tropical storm here at the beginning of the week. So, but anyway, this system is not very threatening and is not going to become something strong very fast, and does have a lot of hurdles to jump in order to reach any formidable strength here. The National Hurricane Center doesn't really have too high hopes for the system's intensification here. So, something to watch, definitely. This is, we're getting closer to the peak season. This is kind of like a reminder that you should have your hurricane kits ready and all your preparations ready for a hurricane if one does in fact come your way. But anyway, we're going to talk about 95L here now as this system moves off to the west here. This is a little better defined than Fred, which is kind of sad if you're comparing it to Fred here. But you can see that under the clouds there may be a lower level circulation of some sort over or on the northern side of the system. You can see very obvious mid-level spin here that is on the southern side, but the envelope of the wave envelope is generally concentrated now over on the northern side here. And so this is probably pretty close to designation here. It'll likely become a tropical depression, and our next name on the list is Tropical Storm Grace, which it will likely become at some point within the next 3 days at least. And this is probably its most favorable window for development. Shear is very low right now. There's not a whole lot of dry air. If we look at the water vapor loop, you can see that the dry air is off to the north in these darker grays here, but it is not encroaching upon the system, and most of the shear is generally out of the east. And this shear is actually going to drop as this system gets further away from the easterly jet, you can see here. And you can see that this upper level flow is generally light here and generally anticyclonic. So this will actually help the system here over the next couple of days to maybe strengthen a little bit. It could organize some, maybe become a tropical storm here, but then it runs into some problems. If we look at the true color loop over the Atlantic, you can see that as the sun sets over the system, you can see where it is placed. So here you have the system, and it's moving generally off to the west here. There's a couple of issues with this forecast and it's again, the angle of approach and the latitude that it is currently at make this a very difficult forecast in the longer term, and which is why we're going to need to be watching this over the next few days and seeing where exactly it positions itself before it reaches the Caribbean here. Because depending on where that ends up, it may be able to sneak under the Greater Antilles, maybe take this track, maybe take a track over the Greater Antilles, which would be a Fred situation, or to the north of the Greater Antilles, and that track actually is maybe a little more likely than the other two, but the second one and the first one definitely need to be considered when discussing this system, but there are several issues that this would be running into if it went over the northern part of that forecast envelope here. First of all, you can see here an upper level low centered over the northwestern Atlantic here south of Bermuda, and an upper level dip in the jet beginning to develop here. This will eventually become what is known as the tut, which is a very strong trough that dips all the way down into the northern Caribbean here and northwestern Atlantic, and induces a lot of southwesterly flow over any system that does in fact come in here. And no matter how strong it is, it will likely be sheared to some degree, and the shear may be pretty bad and would likely rip up the system. Now, it's not going over land, so it may have a chance after it gets out of this tut, but it will be running into this tut, and this may be something that ends up destroying the system. If we look at the GFS model here, if we go back a couple of hours here, here's 48 hours, system is probably somewhere in this region, and as we go further, you can see that tut beginning to develop here. You have the shear. This is the upper level flow, by the way. You have shear beginning to come out of the west here, and this digs down and actually becomes pretty strong here. And as the system approaches the Caribbean here, you have the tut that it is practically under. And you can see the anticyclone that is currently over Fred also induces northerly shear here. So this is not the most favorable environment for tropical development. So if it runs to the north here of the Greater Antilles, it will be running into a lot of hurdles, and it may pile on those hurdles if it goes over the Greater Antilles. So we're really going to be watching the short-term development here. It's kind of a toss-up at this point in the long term, but if you're on the East Coast, anywhere, really kind of just be watching this. It's not something that's going to be crazy strong and, may be a major hurricane or something. I don't think that's going to happen, and the National Hurricane Center seems to agree. And just need to be watching this over the next few days as the system begins to develop and likely will become a tropical depression within the next 24 hours. That's all I got for now. Thanks for watching.